Mesquite, Nevada. Today I'd like to share some techniques and some processes I've developed over the last many months of taking an image and blowing it up considerably in size, but then dividing it up into sections or grid sections, and then assembling that with dividers between the grid sections, kind of for an artistic element for the finished product. And as an example, here I've got one that's in the final stages of being finished, but you can see it's a 3x7 grid image of this piece of artwork by M.C. Escher, and then with some small dividers between all the grid elements, and they stand about 1/16 inch proud of the actual image itself. I've finished these in two different ways. On several, after I've got it assembled, I do an epoxy pour over this and bring the level of the epoxy to above these dividers. It's a little more work, and the wood definitely needs to be sealed or it will release air bubbles into the epoxy as it cures. The other finishing technique that I've used is, once I've got it finished, I spray it with a clear satin lacquer and then frame it behind glass. And I like both effects, and they turn out very nice. The wood I'm using is alder. I buy it, it's planed a little thicker than I get it from a home center. It's a little rough, but sands very well, and I also tell them don't finish any of the edges. I do that myself on my machinery. What I like to do for these projects is I like to slab off pieces in a thickness that I desire and the width and the length that fits on my machinery, so that I don't have to try and cut those slabs off after I burn the image. So, as an example, I would take, say, a blank like this, and I'll run it through my table saw. I usually cut my blanks about 3/16 of an inch thick, but I don't cut all the way through this piece of wood. I'll set my saw just below halfway through here, run it both sides, and then I'll take it to my bandsaw and just cut that little remaining strip down the middle, and then put it on the sander, and I sand my surfaces, and now I've got my blanks that are ready to be mounted into my machines. And these are examples of my blanks. They're 3/16 inch slabs. This one here for this project, where I can get one image here and one image here, and then depending on the technique I'm using, I can either have a laser cut out the image, or I true up one edge and use my saws in the shop to do my final trimming. Now I have two different machines. One of them has a powerful enough laser to cut through this material fairly easily in not too many passes. But that machine is hard to orient one of the edges parallel to the travel of the laser head. And so on that machine, I tend to burn my image and then let the laser cut it out. And that way, if my wood's skewed a little bit, I still get my images square. On my other machine, I have a stop at the front that is perfectly parallel to my laser head, so that I always know that the bottom edge of my image is parallel to this bottom edge of the wood. And that comes into play when you start to trim these pieces down to make your grid. The image isn't skewed a little bit, and you either end up cutting off a little portion of the image, or you leave some of the untreated wood. But anyway, the imaging doesn't come out right, and then when you assemble the grid, they don't line up properly. So, two different approaches to that. So, I'll show you shortly after I burn my images of the two different ways that we're going to assemble two of these projects. But for now, I'm going to go to my saw, produce all the blanks that I need for my machinery, and then I'll be back. Well, let's continue. It took a couple days to burn my images. So we're doing two projects, one on one laser and the same image on another laser. They're little different sizes, but the same image. So on my laser machine that has, I know that the front edge has a stop that's perfectly parallel to the x-axis travel on my machine. I burned two images per blank, and then I also had the laser burn in some registration marks. And what I'll use these registration marks for is they will guide me on how much, where I want my cuts to be. And on my other machine, what I did was I let the laser burn my image, and then I had it cut off one edge of the image, so that I know that this cut and this cut will be perfectly perpendicular because I have one true edge. So on this one I have a true edge to start my cuts with, and on this image I know that the bottom of this image is parallel to this edge, and so that gives me another reference where I can start making perpendicular cuts and cut up to my registration marks and trim all the pieces. And this becomes apparent how precise you are in these cuts when you start to line these images up. If you're off a little bit, if you take off too much on one side, the elements in each part of the grid section, they don't line up properly and they don't look right. And so there have been a few times where I've had to reburn an image and retrim the wood just because I messed up. So I'll shut off the camera, we'll set up, and we'll start trimming these pieces down to their final dimensions, and then we'll go from there. Okay, I'm back. I spent an hour or two doing the final trimming on all my panels. For the ones that I had the laser cut on the edge, I started by taking off one edge, and then from there, between the crosscut saw and my table saw, I trimmed all my panels down to size. And the process was pretty similar for both sets of images. Now it's time to start adding the dividers. For the vertical dividers on the sides of each panel, I would go ahead and cut them with my laser, and that way I know that they're very accurate as to how they fit the image segment top to bottom. And since I have a very narrow edge here, how I glue that together is I take an eye drop bottle that's used. I drill the tip with a 1/16 inch drill bit, and what that does is it gives me a very accurate and finely metered amount of glue on the edge of this, so that when I do clamp my dividers into place, I don't get any ooze out onto the image itself. Also, for maintaining a true perpendicular edge, trying to keep this whole image square, I set up a frame on my little workbench here with two pieces of wood that I know that are that are perpendicular to one another. I use a drafting T-square to set that up, and I put wax paper under that. And the wax paper just releases the glue really easily, rather than having a panel glued to my work surface underneath, easy to separate. Each row, I'll glue a piece on, glue the next panel, another divider, and then when I have all the rows assembled, then I can measure for my other dividers, my horizontal dividers, cut those and then assemble the whole picture. Now for these, like I said, I cut these with a laser, and that leaves a burn edge on the visible side of the divider. For the longer dividers, I could cut them with a laser, but I opt to I set my table saw at a certain depth, I set it at a 1/4 inch, and I cut both sides, and then I'll run it through the saw again and just cut off 1/16 inch wide strips that I can use as my longer dividers. But that leaves an unburned edge on them, and so what I do is I take a wood burning tool and I just quickly go over this edge and burn it, and I end up with the same burnt edge look as I got with my vertical dividers. Assembling these, I'll just start, say, in the upper left hand corner, the first, run a bead of glue on there, I place a divider in, and then I'll just put a little block of wood up against it, put some pressure on it, and then just clamp it in place and let it set. And I just continue that process for each row. Then once I have all the rows assembled, I make sure they all fit together nicely, and then I start to, like I said, I'll cut the dividers, and then we can start to assemble the whole picture. So from that point, I'm going to stop. I've got a bunch of gluing to do, and then we'll look at how everything's turning out. Well, we're getting near the end. I have all my horizontal rows glued together, and then I'll make sure that my edges are smooth and precise. It's just a little hand sanding just to make sure that everything fits together nicely. And then I also have cut my horizontal dividers to the size and length, and I've burned the edge so that it matches the vertical pieces in the picture. And I'm finishing up the second one. The first one is assembled, and you can see here now it's an entire panel with my dividers. The last thing I'll do for these two images is, since I intend to lacquer these and place them behind glass, I want to add a little border around the outside. And I'll make the border the same height as my dividers, and I just cut some strips of 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, and we'll frame it. And these don't need to be mitered on the corners. For the most part, they're going to be hidden by the frame that they're mounted in once they're finished. And so just putting the border on brings the whole image into view under the glass, and you don't lose any of that image under the edge of the picture frame. When I glue these horizontal segments into place, I'll run a little bead of glue, place my divider, and then I put a block down, and then I add some pressure, and I made a little device. It's just a piece of wood that I drilled 2 holes in, put a steel bar in there, a couple of springs, and what it does is it gives me the ability to put those pieces together, put a little pressure on this, and then clamp it in place and just let that glue cure. And I just keep repeating that process until the panel's done. The good thing with glues is they dry within 20 minutes to half an hour. They're at 80% of their full strength, and so you don't have to wait overnight for this glue to cure. And again, like I mentioned before, using an eye drop bottle lets you precisely measure and meter that glue onto the edge so you don't get it glue oozing out onto the picture. So I'll go ahead and I'll finish assembling these. I'll frame them, and then we'll wrap this up. So I'm done with this part of the project. I got my panels are glued up into finished products. My final steps were to take all these individual rows and cut my dividers to size, and then glue these rows together. And then I finished off each finished panel with some 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch wood that just frames it all in. And when I glue those on, I make sure that my panel is flat, and so I end up with a nice flat panel. Sometimes I'll back these with some kind of thin backing before I place them into frames. But at this point, both images are complete and they're ready for finishing. Now, one thing I did notice as I was assembling these is that the dimensions are quite different. Now these were actually created from two different images, two different image files. This one was the first one I started playing with, and when I got through burning all my panels on this one, I had noticed that there was a little watermark down here. Now that doesn't bother me because this is going to be finished and it's going to be hanging in my home. This was a different file, and when I assembled this one, the dimensions of this are very accurate to what the original picture was, and so I started looking at this one going, why is that one rectangular and this one's almost square? What also threw me off was the author's signature block appears in the upper left-hand corner in both images. But when I started looking closer, you notice on this window here, we have a complete window, and here it's cut off. And down here are the lizards complete, and here the lizards are like cut in half. So somebody at some point cropped this image in height. They took some off the top and they took some off the bottom, but the left and right were apparently left alone. It's a little odd that somebody went to the trouble not only to crop some of this image off, but also to reproduce the artist's signature block and move it down onto the altered image. But anyway, they are the same image, but they are different as far as their dimensions, but I'm happy with both projects. At this point, they're ready for me to spray with some lacquer, and then I'll get them framed behind glass, and they'll be finished products. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's taken me about 2 weeks to put this all together, just because there are so many elements in producing this, plus there were 2 projects involved. But again, if you like it, hit the like button. I can always use those. I am going to do a video on the software that I wrote to break these images up into grids, but even if you're using your own image editors, you can break them up. It's just more work to figure out the coordinates you want and the sizes you want, but it can be done. But again, I'll do a video on my gridded software and post that as soon as I can to posting this video. Anyway, from Mesquite, Nevada, I'm Alex. Thank you for watching.